In the 1800s, many American immigrants spent countless hours in factories and labor intensive jobs. They were hopeful one day to become the American dream. For most of the immigrants, though, they weren't able to make the push from the working class to the elite class. A very tiny proportion of them actually did hit it successful, though. You have your Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, Carnegies, and they all came from poor families and eventually became some of the most successful American businessmen the US has ever seen. Now, if you thought this video would focus on the rags to riches story, you'd be mistaken. This is about one man who not only became a part of the establishment, but actually was the establishment and laid the foundations for what the establishment would be in modern times. This story is about John Pierpont Morgan. Before we talk about JP Morgan, we have to talk about the family that came before him. Miles Morgan was the first Morgan in America. He immigrated from Wales and arrived in America in 1636, searching for a new life and probably a lot of adventure as well. At a young age, he became second in command of the town he was living in and became a well established landowner. He paved the way for the success of the Morgan family in America and established generational wealth for them. Fast forward around 200 years, and Junius Morgan, who is J.P. Morgan's father, wanted to take the already established Morgan family to new levels of wealth. Junius worked his way up the economic hierarchy slowly, starting with a recommendation from his father that landed him a partnership with a clothing company called Howe Leather Company. Eventually, after partnering with many different people and companies, he partnered with George Peabody and went on to make a successful banking firm, which Junius would later inherit after Peabody's retirement and eventual death. George Peabody always had a chip on his shoulder. As an American banker in the early to mid 1800s, he was not respected too much by the big British banking families such as the Rothschilds or the Baring brothers. He felt that if they didn't respect him and his work, then he was not succeeding. He went out of his way to try and fit in with the ruling class of Britain, which often made him talk condescendingly and just become a total douchebag to other American bankers, as in his eyes, if they weren't friends of the British elite, they were inferior. George Peabody was like that one kid in high school that always tried to fit in with the popular crowd, and to do so, he had to treat his old friends like second class citizens to gain their approval. I guess that analogy works if by popular crowd you mean snobbish, power hungry British banking dynasties. Well, to think about it, is life just high school with extra steps? Anyways, this type of mindset is why George Peabody cannot find happiness. He had all of the money in the world, but still, he would always try and get the approval of the wealthy British families. He didn't find true happiness until he donated a big chunk of his wealth near the end of his life. After Peabody retired in 1864, Junius took the firm to new heights, especially after he even impressed the Rothschilds when he loaned France money for the Franco-Prussian War, which made him a lot of money, of course. Even with this success, he could only go so far, and soon, his own son would outshine him. It was important to give the context for Junius Morgan and George Peabody, as it showed the elitist mentality of the men that came before Pierpont. Quick side note, I'll now refer to JP Morgan as Pierpont for the rest of the video. It was actually George Peabody who started the House of Morgan, but when he gave it to Junius, he let him rename it to his last name. Regardless, Pierpont always knew he was meant for something better, and actually, he didn't even need to know that he was meant for greater things because his dad instilled values of hard work and determination in him, and made sure that he always had a watchful eye on Pierpont. Junius was worried with Pierpont ever since he was a young boy. He thought that he was too goofy and unhinged, and as the only male heir left for the family's emerging fortune, he had to have a male heir that would elevate their bank and not destroy it. Pierpont knew what he was made of, though, and didn't see his personality as something harmful to business, but actually as a benefit. He would use his great gift of negotiating to broker deals, a lot of the time deemed too risky by his father, but he would go through with it anyways. He once bought 5,000 guns from the US government during the early stages of the Civil War. Many of them were in a state of disrepair, so he got them at a low price of $3.50 per gun. Then he pretty much loaned somebody to buy the guns from him at a much higher price of $11.50. The guy that bought the guns then fixed all of them and sold the now fixed guns to General John C. Fremont of Missouri for a price of $22 per gun. The government bought back its own guns, better repaired, mind you, but still spent over 6 times the price they sold it for in a span of 3 months. It's safe to say that Pierpont was absolutely balling back in the 1860s. Tricky schemes like these would make Pierpont able to obtain wealth of his own, but these schemes would only be the start of it. And even though he didn't always agree with his father, he listened to his advice most of the time because he knew most of his wealth was only made possible by his father. That said, Pierpont still did a lot of things differently. Something that Pierpont did a lot differently was his involvement in business. When Pierpont financed companies, he didn't just finance them, but he also usually became an advisory or board member of the company. The first great example of this is when Pierpont started to form his railroad empire. He had this major dispute. The dispute happened in 1869 and was about an upstate New York rail line. In the dispute, Pierpont asserted himself as the central figure and demanded that the rail line merge with another one to stop competition. This meeting was so heated, in fact, that allegedly Pierpont threw a man down a flight of stairs. Okay, I guess the story is not super credible and probably not true, but it's cooler to think that it happened, okay? In the end, Pierpont was victorious after a New York judge ruled in his favor, and the rail line was merged with another company that Pierpont had control over. Even with this newfound power, Pierpont's transition to the establishment was really just beginning, as he was still not fond of the British banking families, and he even went against his father's word when he married a common woman with tuberculosis. He also concerned his father greatly because of how risky Pierpont tended to be. This more rebellious side of Pierpont would slowly fade away though, and a new side of Pierpont would be sprung up to take its place. Pierpont's rise may have been explosive, but he was still lacking an achievement that other businessmen like Rockefeller and Carnegie had, and that achievement was an entire industry built from the ground up. Sure, after railroad titan Cornelius Vanderbilt's death, Pierpont was probably one of the biggest businessmen in railroads. But it's not like he built it from scratch like Vanderbilt did. However, there was an industry in its infancy stage that with the right funding could be the next big thing, and that industry was electricity. A young inventor named Thomas Edison was on the verge of one of the greatest technologies to ever affect humanity. He had made many inventions before, but none of them were really used or even practical in day-to-day life. After countless hours and hard work going through hundreds of different materials and variables, Thomas Edison finally did it, and invented the light bulb as we know it today. When Pierpont heard about this revolutionary technology, he wanted in. There was only one problem though. His father was strongly against him investing a large chunk of the Morgan fortune into an unproven industry. This is where Pierpont and his father differed the most. Whereas Pierpont's father would not take huge risks that could potentially change the world and how we live, rather choosing to slowly create wealth without really changing much of anything, Pierpont chose to chase after industries and business with potential to really make a difference. That's why he not only invested in companies, but also controlled part of the company. He didn't necessarily want the money, he wanted the power. Knowing this mindset of Pierpont, it's easy to see why he ignored his father's advice and invested in Thomas Edison anyways. Together, they're able to create DC, or direct current electricity. At first, they were doing pretty good, but then two main problems arose. The first one was getting the infrastructure in place to light up cities, because it was hard and costly. And the second problem was that Thomas Edison's former co-inventor Nikola Tesla created a new type of electricity called AC, or alternating current electricity. These two problems culminated at Niagara Falls, where a huge dam was being built to generate electricity, and they were deciding to either have Edison's DC or Tesla's AC. They eventually went with Tesla's AC, which crushed Pierpont's spirit, and was the last straw for his father, who was forcing Pierpont to now stop investing in Thomas Edison. Things were looking very bad for Pierpont as he failed at his gamble on electricity, but worst of all, he looked like a failure to his father, who was his role model, I think out of any moment in his life. It was this moment that really transformed him from a more rebellious type of businessman to the big establishment titan of industry. that he would soon become. He realized that by playing by someone else's rulebook, he can never reach his full potential because he was not fully in charge of the situation that was handed to him. In the case of Pierpont, that would be him acting more as an advisory to Thomas Edison rather than a true business partner. Pierpont knew if he could just do something drastic and have one more chance, he could turn it around, and that second chance came unfortunately with the death of his father in 1890. Pierpont truly loved and looked up to his father, but the fortune and bank that Pierpont inherited from his father's death gave him the wealth to have a second chance. Pierpont was sick of Thomas Edison being in charge of the direction of how things were being done, especially because he pretty much financed all of Edison's research and the creation of the light bulb and DC electricity. So he decided to take charge and make change. He did this by buying out the majority of Edison's stock in the company he created, which gave Pierpont control of the company. Soon after that, he renamed the company to General Electric and went on to transform it into the biggest electric company in the nation. Virtually having a monopoly over the entire electric industry, Pierpont's transformation was complete. No longer was he the more sketchy-like businessman that pulled off tricky schemes to make a little bit of profit. Rather, he was now a titan of industry who had the respect of every businessman on Wall Street. He still didn't really like the British banking families, but he learned to look past that as he knew that doing business with them would be very lucrative. It didn't mean he liked them anymore, but he learned to do business with people he didn't like. I'll do business with anyone, but I'll only go stealing with gentlemen. Pierpont Morgan. He learned to separate business and friendships. This is why he became even more successful as time went on. He proceeded to use his newfound power to try and make the American financial system as good as it could be. This often meant trying to stop competition with competing companies in various different industries. In many cases, it actually worked, and he was able to stop competition to an extent in certain industries. He even bailed out the US government in 1893 by simply standing outside the White House and waiting for President Grover Cleveland to pretty much beg for him to bail them out. Pierpont truly was setting and breaking the established rules of America at the time, and was easily one of, if not the most powerful person in America, maybe to only Rockefeller or Carnegie. Although in 1901, Pierpont bought out Carnegie Steel and combined it with his other steel companies to create the largest company in America and the first $1 billion company in the world. So I guess you could be the judge of who's more powerful, but remember this: Rockefeller only had a monopoly on oil, whereas Pierpont had a monopoly over the railroads, electricity, and now steel. So it's easy to say that Pierpont was at the top of the US economy. For the rest of his life, though, Pierpont would be in some kind of controversy, and the grip on his monopolies would finally start to be in some sort of jeopardy. Pierpont's success was explosive to say the least, but with this success came many more challenges, starting with US President William McKinley being assassinated 10 months after he won the 1900 election. For most people, it was a tragedy. For Pierpont, it was the worst case scenario possible. You see, back in those days, the ultra-wealthy businessmen at the time bought the president, and by that I mean they threw a bunch of money at their campaign to plaster their campaign all over America. Pierpont was part of the group that bought William McKinley. There was a problem though. An up-and-coming politician named Teddy Roosevelt hated big monopolies. The way the businessmen dealt with him at the time was to make him vice president, a seemingly powerful position, but in reality, a useless position where most political careers went to die. When McKinley died, Teddy Roosevelt became president, and one of the first things he did was take Pierpont to court. Roosevelt's main argument was that Pierpont violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, and apparently the Supreme Court agreed with Roosevelt, and in a 5-4 vote, they ruled that Pierpont violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Just like that, Pierpont's stranglehold on the railroads was broken up into many different companies. This event is something that Pierpont always dreaded, as it was the first major setback he'd experienced in any of his monopolies. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't really affect Pierpont too much, as he was still a very powerful business mogul. What it did do was reveal weakness and show that Pierpont was not invincible. Before long, though, Pierpont was on to the next industry to monopolize, that industry being shipping. Pierpont poured lots of money into shipping, negotiated with owners of other shipping companies, and even met with leaders of various nations to discuss terms of the sea. All of the hard work, though, would be in vain as Pierpont's shipping dream would be a failure. In his eyes, if America controlled the railroads and shipping, it would benefit the world. Not only that, but it would make Pierpont even more powerful. The thought might have been one of good intention, but in the end, not only was it a failure, but also the first industry that Pierpont tried to monopolize that he couldn't, further showing weakness and cracks in Pierpont's power. The final event that was really bad for Pierpont was the Titanic. You might have known that the Titanic was created by the White Star Line, but what you may not have known is that Pierpont owned that company. Pierpont was a big financer of that Titanic, and when it sank, it was a very bad look for Pierpont, and he probably felt horrible that so many people perished as well, and probably felt partially responsible for it. This was surely a stain on his career, and a bad look for Morgan Bank, especially combined with all the previous failures that I've already listed. Nevertheless, Pierpont was still very powerful, and these events didn't really affect his wealth all that much. It was more of a symbolic failure more than anything. And that's not to say that he didn't do a lot of things right as well during this time. Like in 1902 when he resolved the coal miner strikes by negotiating with the coal mine owners, or in 1907 when Pierpont almost single-handedly saved the country from an economic collapse that could have been as bad or worse than the Great Depression by bailing out most of the banks that were about to go bankrupt. This not only benefited the regular American, but also Pierpont himself because he was able to buy up so many companies for very cheap prices during the panic. Pierpont was definitely still on top, and even with the setbacks he had, they really only made a dent, if anything, in his massive power. This power would not last for much longer, as on March 31st, 1913, at the age of 75, Pierpont would perish in Rome, Italy. Pierpont's legacy was not one of hardship, as he was born into wealth, but one of being able to work harder and smarter than anyone else. He conquered practically unbeatable odds when he became wealthier and more powerful than his father, who already had such high standards when it came to his legacy. He did this not by getting lucky, but by doing what no one else would, and taking a risk when the risk could be society changing, like in railroads, electricity, steel, and even in industries where he failed, like in shipping. The type of mindset he had was so much different than almost anyone else, and he left his family with arguably the most powerful and wealthiest bank in the world, which would allow his son to carry on the Morgan Bank further into the 20th century to finance many more companies and to continue the Morgan wealth. Pierpont's legacy was so prominent that JP Morgan Bank is to this day one of the biggest banks in the world, General Electric exists today, and US Steel is still around. Pierpont was able to form banks and companies to last over a century and in some cases still dominate the market. In life, especially when we were younger, we view the establishment as something bad and evil that only cares about money. And while that may be true to an extent, most of the people in the establishment, at least in America, work their way up and use their unmatched ambition and intelligence to create a product or service that affects how consumers spend their money, as 88% of millionaires were self-made. These people most of the time can't stand working for anyone else but themselves and don't just want to be part of the future, but they want to make the future. In Pierpont's case, he created a new establishment in New York and had control over much of the US economy. Like Pierpont, these people had to make concessions and do stuff they didn't fully agree with, like how Pierpont did not want to do business with the Rothschilds, but knew it was in his best interest to do business with them, so he did. It didn't mean that they were friends, just that they were working in their mutual best interest for each other. So if you ever feel like the so-called establishment isn't treating you fairly or not working in your best interest, don't try and rebel against it. Try and become a part of it, as you will see how hard these people have to work and how different these people's mindsets are from the average Joe. And hey, if you work hard enough and smart enough, maybe even you can become the next Pierpont Morgan.